The brass key had always stuck in the cylinder of my apartment door if the humidity rose above 80%. On that particular Tuesday, it took 3 hard twists and a shoulder against the frame to get the lock to click. Outside, the rain was coming down in that heavy vertical way that made the streetlights look like blurred yellow smudges in the October dark. My boots were damp. My drafting tube was tucked under my arm like a dry bone, and all I wanted was 20 minutes of absolute silence before I had to open my laptop to finish the structural calculations for a 3-story municipal garage. But when the door finally gave way, the silence was already gone. Instead of the familiar dry smell of my old pine floorboards and cold tea, the entryway smelled of damp cardboard, wet wool, and something sharp and green, like crushed cedar needles. The small lamp on my sideboard was on, casting a long, unfamiliar shadow across the hallway. And there, in the middle of my living room, the 12 by 14 space I had spent 3 years keeping perfectly sparse, was a stack of 6 plastic storage bins, a rolled-up fiber rug, and a young woman in a gray sweater trying to assemble a metal-framed desk with a small Allen wrench. We both froze. The wrench slipped from her fingers, clattering against the metal leg before rolling to a stop near my damp left boot. She had her dark hair pinned up with a plastic clip, a smudge of gray graphite on the side of her jaw, and an expression that wasn't frightened so much as it was incredibly, deeply tired. "Can I help you?" I asked. My voice sounded flat, even to my own ears, carrying the exhaustion of a 12-hour shift at the firm. She stood up slowly, wiping her palms on her jeans. She didn't apologize, and she didn't run. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her sweater and pulled out a folded sheet of yellow paper. "I think I'm the one who should be asking you that. This is apartment 3B. "It is," I said, putting my drafting tube down on the small table by the door. "And I've lived here since 2014. She handed me the paper. It was a standard lease agreement, signed 3 days ago, with the stamp of the Henderson Property Group at the bottom. My own lease, identical in every way, except for the commencement date and the name at the top. Julianne Vansley, in the bottom drawer of my desk. Mr. Henderson told me the previous tenant had moved out over the weekend," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it had a steady, practical weight to it. "He said he left the spare key under the utility box in the hall. I let myself in 2 hours ago. Henderson is 72, lives in Florida, and hasn't checked his database since the turn of the century," I said, rubbing the bridge of my nose where my glasses had left 2 small, cold indentations. The tenant who moved out was in 3A. Across the hall, he had the same floor plan, but his kitchen faced the alley. Henderson must have written B on your copy because he can't read his own handwriting. She looked at the yellow lease, then at the 6 bins, then back at me. The rain gave a sudden, heavy rattle against the glass of the bay window behind her. "He's not answering his phone. He won't until Thursday," I replied. "He goes to a fishing camp on the Keys every Tuesday morning. No cell service, no email, just a radio that he turns off when he's drinking." Julianne sat down on the edge of one of her plastic bins. She didn't cry. She just leaned her elbows on her knees and stared at the unfinished desk frame. "The movers left at 5. They charged me double because of the rain and the stairs. Every hotel within 30 miles is booked because of the municipal convention." "The Water Resource Summit," I muttered. "I forgot that started today." "The Water Resource Summit," she repeated, a dry, faint smile touching her lips for a fraction of a second, "which means there isn't a single bed, cot, or empty floor space in the county. I called 4 places before the movers left."
"Nothing."
I looked at her, then at my apartment. My flat was small, but it was organized with the clean, geometric precision of someone who drew blueprints for a living. To the left was my drafting table, clear of everything except 3 perfectly aligned rabbitograph pens and a T-square. To the right was my small kitchen, where the copper pots hung from hooks spaced exactly 4 inches apart. And in the corner was my single bedroom, behind a sliding wooden door I had built myself from salvaged cedar. "You're a landscape designer," I said, pointing to a plastic tub where several rolled-up site plans were sticking out like green shoots. She looked up. "How did you know that?" "The cedar oil," I said. "And the drafting paper? It's high-weight vellum. Only people who draw site details by hand still use that specific yellow roll. Most architects went digital 5 years ago." She let out a slow breath, her shoulders dropping an inch. "I'm Julianne." "Thomas," I said. I hung my wet jacket on the wooden peg by the door, making sure the hem didn't touch the plaster. "The convention is 48 hours. The leasing office opens at 9 on Thursday morning. We have 2 choices. We can spend the next 2 hours arguing in the hall while the rain ruins your rugs, or we can figure out how to divide 48 square yards of floor space without making each other miserable." She looked at me, her eyes assessing my dry boots, my neat shelves, and the absolute lack of clutter in the room. "You have a lot of rules, don't you, Thomas?" "I have systems," I corrected. "They keep the ceiling from falling on my head. For instance, the left side of the kitchen counter is for food preparation. The right side is for clean dishes. If you put a wet mug on the wood, it leaves a ring." "I've been drawing drainage profiles for 6 years," she said, standing up and picking up the Allen wrench. "I understand boundaries. What's the plan?" I walked to the sliding cedar door of my bedroom, opened it, and pointed inside. "You take the bedroom. It has a lock on the inside. My mattress is firm, the sheets are clean, and there's a small desk in the corner if you need to work. I'll take the sofa in here." She frowned, looking at the narrow gray wool sofa against the wall. "That's barely 6 feet long. You're at least 6'1". "6'2", I said, "and I've slept on worse during site surveys in the county flats. My gear stays in the hall closet. I won't need to enter the room. We share the bathroom, but we set a schedule. I'm out of here by 7:30 in the morning. If you need the shower before then, we adjust." Julianne watched me for a long moment. She didn't offer any excessive gratitude, and she didn't try to make light of the situation. Her focus was entirely on the logistics. "What about my boxes?" "We leave them in the center of the room for now," I said. "As long as I can reach my drafting table, we're fine." "Do you eat eggs?" She blinked, surprised by the sudden shift. "Yes, good. I have 6. We'll split them." "Don't touch the cast iron skillet with soap. If you wash it, use hot water and a stiff brush, then dry it immediately. If it rusts, I have to re-season it, and that takes 3 hours in a hot oven." "Understood," she said, her expression softening into something resembling amusement. "No soap on the cast iron? I think I can manage that without a permit." "You'd be surprised how many people can't," I muttered. I picked up her heaviest storage bin, the one labeled Plant Pathology and Soil Mechanics, and carried it into the bedroom. It was heavy, smelling of dry dirt and paper. When I set it down near the window, I noticed her drawing kit, a neat leather roll containing 20 different lead holders, 3 soft brushes, and an old brass compass that had seen decades of fieldwork. It was worn, but clean. The tools of someone who respected the material. When I came back out, Julianne was standing by my dining table, looking at my municipal garage blueprint. Her finger was hovering an inch above the drainage culvert detail on the south elevation. "Your runoff calculations are too conservative," she said without looking up. I stopped in the doorway. "Excuse me? Your retention basin is calculated for a 10-year storm event," she said, her finger tracing the blue lines. "But you're building on the lower terrace of the clay shelf. In a 50-year event, the water from the upper ridge will bypass your culvert entirely and pull against the foundation wall of level 1. It'll cause hydraulic pressure against the concrete within 5 years. The city only requires a 10-year standard for municipal garages, I said, my voice narrowing slightly. The city is run by people who don't have to shovel the silt out of the basement, she replied. She turned to face me, her green smudged chin lifted slightly. If you increase the slope of the swale by 2% and use a native grass matrix instead of gravel, you can reduce the pressure by 40% without changing your structural concrete budget. I looked at the blueprint, then at Julianne. She was small, tired, and her left sleeve was dark with rainwater, but her eyes were bright with the absolute certainty of someone who knew exactly how water moved through soil. We'll talk about the swale tomorrow, I said, though I secretly made a mental note to check her calculations on my software. Right now, you need to dry your jacket. The radiator in the kitchen is the only one that doesn't hiss. Like an angry cat, she smiled then, a small, quiet expression that made the damp, crowded living room feel slightly larger than it had 5 minutes ago. Thanks, Thomas. Don't thank me yet, I said, walking to the hall closet to retrieve my sleeping bag. I snore when the humidity is high, and tonight it's 92%. The first night was a lesson in sound. The sofa was too short, as Julianne had predicted. My feet hung over the armrest, wrapped in a wool blanket that smelled of cedar and old wool. But the physical discomfort wasn't what kept me awake. It was the rhythm of the apartment. For 3 years, I had lived alone in a silent box, knowing exactly when the pipes would clank and when the wind would rattle the loose pane in the kitchen. Now, there was a second heartbeat in the flat. Through the thin cedar door, I could hear the occasional rustle of paper. Julianne was working. Every 20 minutes or so, there would be the soft, rhythmic click of her lead holder against the drafting board, a sound I knew intimately. It was the sound of someone hunting for a line, drawing, erasing, and drawing. Again. Around 2 in the morning, the rain settled into a steady, low roar that filled the room like static. I sat up, my knees aching from the cramped angle of the sofa, and walked into the kitchen to get a glass of water. The light under the bedroom door was still on, casting a thin golden line across the dark pine floorboards. As I reached for the tap, the cedar door slid open 3 inches. Julianne stood there, her hair down now, her eyes shadowed with fatigue. She was holding an empty ceramic mug. The radiator stopped, she said. Her voice was a low whisper, as if she were trying not to disturb the silence she had inherited. It does that at 2, I said, filling my glass. The building boiler has a timer. It saves the landlord $40 a month in coal gas. It'll kick back on at 5. She leaned against the doorframe, her knuckles pale, around the handle of her mug. I have a presentation at noon tomorrow with Dr. Vance, no relation, unfortunately. He's the head of the County Development Board, and he thinks landscape design is just choosing between red and white geraniums. Vance is a bureaucrat, I said, leaning against the counter. He wants things that look clean in a brochure and don't require maintenance. If you show him something with a native root matrix, he'll think you're trying to sell him weeds. They're not weeds, she said, her voice tightening with a sudden quiet heat. They're the only things that will keep the hillside from sliding into his parking lot. He wants to pave the entire slope above the bypass road. If he does, the first hard frost will crack the asphalt and the spring thaw will wash the whole shoulder down into the creek. He won't believe you until the road slides, I said. That's how county budgets work. They won't spend $10,000 to prevent a slide, but they'll spend $80,000 to clean it up after it happens. She looked down at her empty mug. I spent 3 months on this proposal, Thomas. If I lose this contract, my studio doesn't make rent next month. I'll be back to drawing suburban lawn irrigation plans for developers who think a 45-degree angle is a creative triumph. I looked at her, then down at the kitchen counter, There was a faint smudge of graphite on the white laminate where she had set her empty mug. I reached for the dish towel, carefully wiped the mark away, and then looked back up. "Show me the site plan," I said. She blinked, her eyes wide in the dim kitchen light. "What?" "Show me the plan," I repeated. "I have my laptop. I can run a digital hydraulic model in 10 minutes. If Vance wants to see numbers, we'll give him numbers he can't argue with, but you have to make the tea. The Earl Grey is in the blue tin. Don't touch the green one. That's Lapsang Souchong, and it tastes like a campfire." Julianne stared at me for 3 seconds, as if trying to determine if I was making fun of her. Then she let out a short, quiet laugh that sounded like a dry leaf scraping across stone. "Deal. But only if you promise not to tell me my margins are off by 0.5 millimeter. "I can't make that promise," I said, moving toward my desk. "But I'll keep the criticism constructive." For the next 4 hours, the small dining table became a battlefield of straight lines and organic curves. Julianne spread out her site plan, a beautiful hand-drawn layout of the county bypass slope, rendered in soft green and sepia ink. Her work was incredibly detailed, showing every root system, every soil layer, and every rock shelf with the precision of a medical illustration. But her drainage calculations were represented in standard text blocks, easy for a bureaucrat like Vance to overlook or ignore. "See here," I pointed to the screen of my laptop where a gray grid model of the hillside was slowly turning. "Your plant matrix is perfect for absorbing surface moisture, but the subgrade is shale. Once the water penetrates the top 6 inches of topsoil, it hits that rock layer and acts like grease on a slide. The entire soil mass will move as a single block." She leaned over my shoulder, her breath warm against my neck. She smelled of rain and that clean, sharp cedar oil. "So, the plants alone won't hold it if the volume exceeds 3 inches an hour?" "No," I said. "You need a structural key, a retaining system that doesn't look like a concrete wall. If we use a terraced timber cribbing built from salvaged local white oak, we can anchor it into the shale layer with steel pins. Then you pack the cribbing with your root matrix. The timber holds the mass immediately, and the roots take over within 3 seasons as the wood begins to settle." She watched the screen as I ran the simulation. The red lines representing soil stress slowly faded to a cool, stable blue. "The timber cribbing is cheaper than a concrete retaining wall," she whispered, her eyes tracking the numbers. "And it matches the local park aesthetic. Vance loves the local park aesthetic. He has a framed photo of the old covered bridge in his office." "Exactly," I said. "We use his own vanity against him. I'll draft the structural detail for the cribbing. You write the specification for the anchoring. We combine them into a single sheet. We have to use a standard scale," she said, her professional instincts kicking in. 1 to 20. Otherwise, the county engineers will complain they have to use their calculators. "I only draft in 1 to 20, I said, a slight edge of pride in my voice. "Anything else is a sign of moral decay." She laughed, a warm, genuine sound that seemed to chase the damp chill out of the corners of the room. "You're a strange man, Thomas. I am an organized man," I corrected, though I was already setting up a new sheet on my CAD software. "Now, pass me the tea. It's getting cold." We worked until the sky behind the bay window turned the color of a wet slate shingle. By 6 in the morning, the table was covered in coffee cups, empty tea mugs, and 3 printed sheets of structural landscape integration details that had been ran through my small plotter in the corner. They were clean, precise, and carried the unmistakable weight of 2 different minds working toward the same conclusion. Julianne stood up, stretching her arms above her head. Her sweater had a small blue ink stain near the cuff, and her eyes were rimmed with red, but she looked incredibly alive. "You should sleep," I said, packing my laptop into its leather case. "You have 5 hours before your meeting." "I can't sleep now," she said, looking at the printed sheets. My brain is still running the hydraulic model. I feel like if I close my eyes, the hillside will slide. The hillside is currently dry and stable on paper, I said, standing up and stretching my own back, which felt like a piece of dry pine that had been left in the sun too long. Go take the first shower. I'll make the eggs. Remember the rule. No soap on the cast iron, she said, rolling up the finished plans with a neat, practice motion. I've got it, Thomas. It's written in stone. While she was in the bathroom, the apartment felt different. The sound of the shower behind the cedar door was loud in the quiet morning, a steady, rhythmic drumming that seemed to match the rain outside, which had finally slowed to a light, misty drizzle. I stood by the stove, watching the butter melt in the black skillet. I had spent 3 years ensuring that my life was predictable. I knew what time I would wake up, what route I would walk to the office, and what project I would be drafting by 10:15. My flat was my sanctuary, because nothing changed here without my permission. But as I watched the yellow yolk of the first egg spread across the hot iron, I realized I didn't mind the smudge of graphite on the counter. I didn't mind the smell of cedar oil. And I didn't even mind that my wool blanket was currently covered. In Julianne's draft papers, she came out of the bathroom 15 minutes later, wearing a dry, dark green flannel shirt with her hair damp and combed back. She looked small, but there was a sharp, professional focus in her posture that I recognized immediately. She was ready for the fight. Eat, I said, setting a plate of scrambled eggs and dry toast on the table. She sat down, picked up her fork, and took a bite. They're good, a little dry, but good. Eggs are meant to be firm, I said, sitting across from her with my own plate. Runny eggs are a structural hazard. She shook her head, a soft smile on her lips. Is everything a structural hazard to you, Thomas? Most things are, I said, particularly county development boards here. I handed her a small black leather tube from my desk. It's a waterproof carrier. If you walk through the plaza in the rain, your prints will stay dry. If Vance sees a water spot on a blueprint, he'll think you're unprofessional. She took the tube, her fingers brushing against mine for a second. Her hand was warm, her skin slightly rough from field work. Thank you for everything, Thomas. I know this wasn't how you wanted to spend your Tuesday night. I saved a municipal garage from a 50-year flood event, I said, taking a sip of my coffee. It was a highly productive use of my time. And the landscape designer? She asked, her eyes holding mine over the rim of her cup. She has an acceptable eye for scale, I said, my voice dropping slightly, even if her curves are a bit too dramatic for my taste. Curves are what keep the world from breaking, Thomas, she said softly. You'll learn that eventually. By 8, she was gone. The apartment felt incredibly empty. The 6 plastic bins were still stacked in the middle of the room, and her unfinished desk frame stood near the window like a metallic skeleton. The smell of cedar oil lingered, faint but persistent, in the warm air from the radiator, which had started its morning cycle. I walked to the office through the damp, misty streets, my mind refusing to settle on the structural steel details for the garage. Every time I looked at a concrete retaining wall along the parkway, I found myself checking the slope, looking for the native grass matrix that Julianne had described, and wondering if the subgrade was shale. At noon, I sat at my drafting table at the firm, staring at my computer screen. The digital model of the municipal garage was open, but I hadn't made a single entry in 2 hours. Thomas, my supervisor, Mark said, leaning over my partition, you look like you slept in a ditch. Did you finish those garage calculations? I did, I said, opening the file, but I made some changes. He leaned in closer, his glasses slipping down his nose as he scanned the screen. You increased the swale slope. And what's this timber cribbing on the south elevation? That's not in the city handbook. The city handbook is 20 years old, Mark, I said, my voice carrying a quiet confidence that surprised even me. If we build on the clay shelf with their standard, the foundation will suffer hydraulic damage within 5 years. The timber cribbing is cheaper, more sustainable, and it stabilizes the shale subgrade. Mark stared at me, then at the model. He was a practical man, but he respected numbers. Who ran the hydraulic simulation? I did, I said, using a 50-year storm event matrix. It holds. He rubbed his chin, looking at the screen for another 30 seconds. It's a better design, Thomas, I'll give you that. But the client will have to approve the aesthetic change. The client is the city, I said, and the city likes saving 10% on concrete budgets. True, he muttered. Submit it. Let's see if they notice. I spent the rest of the day in a state of quiet anticipation. Every time my phone buzzed, my hand moved toward it before the screen could light up, but there was no word from Julianne. By 6, the rain had started again, a light, cold drizzle that made the walk back to my building feel longer than usual. When I reached the door of 3B, my hand was slightly unsteady as I fitted the key into the brass lock. I pushed the door open. The apartment was dark, except for the small lamp on the sideboard. The 6 plastic bins were gone. The unfinished desk frame had been dismantled, and the fiber rug was rolled up and leaning against the wall in the hallway. On the kitchen counter, next to my clean, dry, cast-iron skillet, lay a single sheet of yellow drafting paper. I walked over and picked it up. Written in a neat, architectural hand was a short message. Thomas Vance approved the cribbing. He said it reminded him of his grandfather's farm. He didn't even look at the drainage calculations once he saw the white oak detail. We signed the contract at 3. Mr. Henderson called while I was at the meeting. He realized his mistake. Apartment 3A is empty and clean. The keys are in the lock. My movers came back at 4 to shift my bins across the hall. Thank you for sharing your 48 square yards. I left your wool blanket on the bed. Julianne, I stood in the quiet kitchen, the paper in my hand. The flat was exactly as it had been on Monday night. Every pot was in its place. The drafting table was clear. The floorboards were clean. There were no smudges of graphite on the counter and no piles of green labeled bins in the center of the room. But it didn't feel like my sanctuary anymore. It just felt empty. I walked to the bay window, looking out at the rain falling on the street below. Across the hall, through the thin walls of the old building, I could hear a faint, rhythmic sound. Click, click, click. It was the sound of a lead holder against a drafting board. Julianne was working on her new layout. I looked down at the cast-iron skillet on the stove, then at the empty kitchen counter. I didn't want to make eggs. And I didn't want 20 minutes of absolute silence. I walked to my desk, picked up my black leather drawing tube, and slid a blank sheet of vellum inside. Then I grabbed my blue tin of Earl Grey tea, walked across the hall, and knocked on the door of 3A. The door opened almost immediately. Julianne stood there, still wearing her dark green flannel shirt, her hair pinned up with that same plastic clip. She looked tired, but when she saw the blue tin in my hand, her eyes softened into a warm, familiar focus. I have a rule about tea, I said, my voice steady in the quiet hallway. It has to be shared. Otherwise, the temperature drop in the mug is too rapid to maintain structural integrity. Julianne looked at the blue tin, then up at my face. A slow, beautiful smile spread across her jaw, chasing away the fatigue of the long week. Come in, Thomas, she said, sliding the door open to reveal a living room filled with stacked boxes and a half-assembled desk. But you have to help me with the desk frame. I still can't find the right angle for the cross brace. That's because you're using a standard right-angle brace on a dynamic frame, I said, stepping over the threshold into the damp cedar-scented air. It's a structural hazard. I knew you'd say that, she laughed. And as the door clicked shut behind me, the silence of the old building faded into the steady, warm rhythm of 2 different lines finally crossing